In part 3 of the treatment of World War II POWs, we are going to take a look at Soviet prisoners of Nazi Germany. While the French experienced many horrors while under German captivity, they had it comparatively easy compared to Soviet prisoners in Germany. The treatment of Soviet prisoners stemmed from Nazi ideology. The Nazis hated communism and Slavic people. This combination meant that the Soviet Union was Nazi Germany's sworn enemy. After the fall of France and the failure of the Luftwaffe's attack on Great Britain, Adolf Hitler decided it was time to rid the world of the Soviet Union. To prepare for their invasion, the Nazi High Command laid out their plan in what was known as General Plan Ost, or Master Plan for the East. These plans laid out how Germany was to exterminate the population of Russia and Eastern Europe. They would, in their words, liquidate any Jews, Slavs, communists, or any others the Nazis determined to be Untermenschen, or undesirables. The people that the Germans decided to not murder would be used as slave labor to serve the Germans in any way they saw fit. With the population either enslaved or dead, the Germans planned to move German families into the former Soviet Union to colonize it. Hitler told his generals that the coming war with the Soviet Union was to be a war for existence, and that the Soviets were to be annihilated. With occupation plans in place, the Germans began amassing the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. On June 22, 1941, 3.8 million Axis soldiers poured over the Soviet Union's border on a front that was nearly 2,000 miles long. The Germans' massive invasion caught the Soviets unprepared, and the results were horrifying for the Russians. Within the first week, over 600,000 Russians were either dead, wounded, or captured. Over the course of the next 5 months, the Soviets would see almost 1 million soldiers killed and 6 million either wounded or captured. With millions of Soviets being captured, it is important to remember that in many situations, especially in 1941, the Germans simply shot any Soviet who tried to surrender. With the Eastern Front being such a brutal war of hatred, being one of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers that were captured by the Germans was a deadly nightmare. While the French had a miserable existence in German captivity, the Germans largely stuck to the Geneva Convention when dealing with American and British and other Allied prisoners of war. Many American prisoners commented after their imprisonment that the Germans treated them as best they could with the resources they had. For the Soviets, this was a completely different picture. By the end of 1941, the first year of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans had captured millions of Soviet soldiers, and 2/3 of them would die in prisoner of war camps. The Germans would watch as they slowly starved the Soviet prisoners to death, or let them die from exposure in brutal winters. By early 1942, the deaths of so many Soviet prisoners of war by the Germans would already rank as one of the highest death rates among mass atrocities in history. Soviet Jews, women combatants, political commissars, many officers, intellectuals, communists, and Asians were systematically executed by the Germans upon capture on the front lines. In most cases, wounded or sick Soviet soldiers who were captured were simply shot on the spot. Out of the survivors, over 1 million were forcibly marched to Germany to serve as slave labor. These Soviet slaves would be worked to death, while in many cases the local German population simply watched as the Soviet prisoners collapsed from starvation or exhaustion. Over 100,000 Soviet POWs were transported to Nazi concentration camps, rather than any prisoner of war camps. In many cases, these prisoners were treated worse than most of their victims. As Russians were captured on the front lines, Germany refused to allow the prisoners to use train cars out of fear of disease. The result was that millions of Soviets were marched in death marches across hundreds of miles with very little food or water. If a soldier fell behind, they were simply shot. In the winter, the Germans would pack many Russians in open cattle wagons, where nearly 200 to 250,000 Russians would freeze to death before ever making it to their destination. German prison camps for captured Soviet soldiers were horrid. They often had no buildings and no latrines. The prisoners were simply packed into 4-wired fences to serve as walls and left in the elements. Many of these camps had no running water and rudimentary kitchens. In the winter, many soldiers tried digging holes to get out of the wind. In one of the largest camps, 30 to 40,000 Soviets would die in captivity. Forcibly starving these prisoners was a common practice by the Germans. Starving Soviets would eat anything they could get their hands on: worms, bark, leaves, clothing. Many of these soldiers were in so much suffering that they wrote handwritten notes to their guards begging to be shot. Some Soviets even resorted to cannibalism to survive, a crime the Germans would shoot Soviets for. In the end, 2.8 to 3.3 million Soviet POWs would die. Life as a POW in World War II was hard, no matter what country you were a prisoner of. Being confined to a prison camp while your families were left wondering about your safety and not being able to see your loved ones until the war ended is enough to make life as a POW a living nightmare. However, the country holding the soldier as a POW and the ethnic background of the individual soldier mattered a lot to the quality of life that soldier could expect to live. For Axis POWs in America, life was relatively good in terms of prison camps and treatment. For American POWs in Germany, it was much the same, except with less food. However, due to the racist and hateful ideology of the Nazis, treatment for POWs could and often were horrific. When World War II came to an end, with the Axis powers left in ruins, the POWs that survived would return home. Many were welcomed as heroes, while many were also shunned and disgraced, but they should never be forgotten.